in the medieval times, people thought that the Earth was the middle of the solar system. Because it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, the Earth's solid. It doesn't move. If it did, we'd fall off. And the sun goes round it because you can see it. So I'll start with something like that. Then I said, well, it's obvious now the government gets its money from taxes and it spends it. So only when you think about it, how can that be right? Then I'll get out, bits of paper, banknotes and say, can you make these yourself? And do the usual idea that the government has to spend or lend money before it can tax. If it wasn't, the private sector would, be counterfeiting and have to make the money.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, modern monetary theorist and PhD scholar Phil Armstrong, talking about two very widely held pieces of what you may think of as common sense, but when you think about them, they really don't sit well together at all. One is that money is collected by the government in the form of taxes and then spent out again to provision that government. And the other one is that only the government or its designated agents can create money. If you or I do it, it's a crime. So what's being said here is that the government is the only entity that can create money, but somehow the government needs to collect money before it can spend. How can those two things be true at the same time? And the answer is they're not. A government that issues its own currency creates new money every time it spends, and taxation removes money from circulation to control inflation, but primarily to create a demand for the government's currency. And we talk more about how that works in the interview. If this is your first encounter with MMT, your inner skeptic might be thinking, there must be a limit to money, even if you're the only one allowed to issue it. Doesn't it have something to do with gold? Well, once upon a time it did, but those days are long gone. What's happened to our money system over time is like that thought experiment. If you have a broom and you replace the brush and then later you replace the handle and you do that over and over, is that then the same broom? Except with our money system, it's like we've replaced the brush with a pickaxe. And now we can't figure out why we keep wrecking the house instead of cleaning it. And this misunderstanding of how our money system works allows our politicians to get away with defining fiscal responsibility as taking more money out of the system to save it for a rainy day. Money that governments don't need to save because they issue it. And they do this as public services crumble and eventually give way under the weight of, say, a global pandemic. There are political voices out there pushing for more provisioning of public services, but when the UK was presented with that policy option last year, people were alarmed that it came with an offer of free broadband, and we're just not ready for that in the UK. It's too radical. So here we are trying to give nurses a pay raise by paying them in rounds of applause. And in the US, any government spending that's not a missile or a tax cut is met with a chorus of, how can we, a country that creates its own currency, possibly afford this? Politicians talk in these terms because the public understands money in these terms. And that's what this podcast aims to change. So thanks as ever for listening and supporting us with kind words and by recommending us to other people. If you are able to support us financially, it starts at $1 a month, which is 80 British pence at the time of recording. It all adds up and helps keep the show going and makes it better. There's a link to our Patreon page in the show notes. Before we dive in, a few things. We talk about Phil's paper he wrote with MMT founder Warren Mosler, and I've linked to where you can find that in the show notes. And that link is also a link to the Gower Institute for Modern Money Studies, or GIMS, who work tirelessly at promoting MMT through publishing articles and organizing events. So check them out, support them, get on their mailing list. We also talk about the sectoral balances accounting identity, and I've linked to a piece by Professor Bill Mitchell, which explains that in detail. And finally, at certain points in the conversation, you'll hear Phil's dog making contributions. So something for everybody. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview, and part 2 will come out next week. Thanks for listening. Let's dive in. Hi, Phil Armstrong. Welcome to the MMT podcast. Great to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
And could you tell the listeners your origin story, how you came to MMT?
Well, it's quite a sort of a convoluted story in a sense. I did a degree in economics in the 1970s, 76 to 79, and I wasn't particularly interested in economics. It was just something that I got through at university. I started doing a degree in accountancy and economics and dropped the accountancy bar. It was both boring and difficult, and so that had to go. Apologies to any accountants out there. If I could have done accountancy, I may have stuck to it. But anyway, I stuck to economics. I got a very standard degree, and then I did some teaching, and I taught pretty much straight away. After that, I had a year's training, went into teaching in 1981, taught in a high school, taught A-level economics. And then sort of mid-80s, one of the guys, Hugo Radici, he was at the University of Leeds, and he thought it was a good idea to get heads of economics, which I was by the mid-80s, to do a master's, because a lot had changed since the 70s to the 80s, Thatcherism, monetarism. I was one of the younger heads of the department, but we were all invited to do a part-time master's at Leeds University. I did that. And that was partly dissertation, partly talk course. And on that course, I met a guy called John Brothwell. And he told me about this mysterious new school that I'd never heard of called post-Keynesianism. I'd never heard of post-Keynesianism. It was never mentioned in my undergrad. And this was like a bit of a wow moment, because this sort of stuff made sense. And this guy was like quite old, but he was a massive enthusiast. And he told me about this guy in America who'd written a lot about money and how the world really works. And the guy was called Paul Davidson. And I read a lot of Paul Davidson's work. I did my MA dissertation on Davidson and Vicky Chick's work. So this is the 80s, and I used quite a lot of Vicky Chick's early work. So my dissertation was on Vicky Chick's work and Paul Davidson. Those were the major influences on me. Then I kind of got on with teaching after I'd finished that. And then round about them, I would say 15 years ago, I got a phone call from somebody at Leeds University, a very polite undergraduate, and she said to me, "How are you doing?" I said, "Fine. Sorry about the dog barking. That's the borrowed dog." She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Fine. I think they're trying to raise some money," because this was the idea of, finding alumni who were quite wealthy. Did we want to support the department? And I said, "Well, I'm not very wealthy. I'm a school teacher." And I said, I talked about doing the masters there in the 80s. She said, "Oh, well, you want to try going to the staff seminars, they'll let you in." I said, "Will they?" And I was getting quite interested, because it was after the crisis. My kids were a bit older. And so I went and joined a thing at Leeds, which was, I suppose you'd call it an economics forum, which is in the evenings. And the staff that ran it were quite eager to get extra people in, because you got lecturers from around the world who were on book tours. And they would come and give various talks, and often they would be a bit empty, because the actual staff would go home about 6 o'clock at night. They don't, because these were in the evenings. And I enjoyed it. I went quite regularly. I got quite enthusiastic about it. So I was really quite interested I got back into economics. And then I started kind of emailing various guys from the post-Keynesian community and asking them questions. Paul Davidson, I asked quite a lot of questions via email, Jeff Harcourt, Mark Lavoie. I didn't really have a reason for doing it. I just asked them what I thought were semi-sensible questions, just because I was interested. And then I thought, well, I've never heard Paul Davidson speak. So I put him into YouTube, and I found this guy called Warren Mosler. You may have heard of him, you may have heard of this guy. Anyway, he was introducing Paul at a post-Keynesian conference. And I just thought, this guy's an entertaining speaker. I wonder who this Warren Mosler guy is. So I Googled him, and I found out what he was about. And I thought, this is quite interesting. So I emailed, I think, I don't know whether somebody worked in his organization. I would say maybe secretary, I don't know. She said, "Oh, you can email Warren directly." And she said, "Yeah, just email him." So I asked him a question. And then over the next couple of years, I just kept on emailing Warren loads and loads of questions. And Warren kept emailing me back loads and loads of answers. So it's basically a dialogue between the two of us. And I got MMT directly from the master. But the thing is, having been a post-Keynesian for all those years, it did not quite work. I knew it didn't quite work, but something was missing. It's like a jigsaw and some bits missing. I was not being over generous to myself, clever enough to realise something was missing, not clever enough to know what that something missing was. You get me? Then Warren filled in the gaps, and then I just became like an unreconstituted Moslerite in that sense, that basically I learned from the master how MMT works, and he got me really interested in MMT. I thought, hey, this is answers to questions. I know how the world works. Like most teachers, I like the sound of my own voice. I then thought I'll do a PhD in MMT, it'd be good fun. I got rejected by Leeds, too old. But I did get accepted by Southampton Solent, and I'm now in the 4th year of my PhD on MMT and its links to heterodox economics. It just gives me an excuse to go to conferences and talk to people. What are you doing here? Well, I'm doing a PhD. So rather than say, I just like it. And I work part-time in the engineering division at York College to pay some bills, but I also get a pension. So that's how I came to it. And really, I just, I'm very close to GIMS now. You know, that they're absolutely inspirational people. I like to talk on their behalf.
They're warriors, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. And they know tons themselves. I mean, Sarah and Prue and Claire, they can all speak brilliantly. They just maybe could speak a bit more. When I was talking at Newport, I kept bringing them in and they were adding stuff I don't know. So it's just nice to have like a more technical type of guy next to them. But I'm just a bit of an advocate for MMT, and I get out there and tell people all about it. And obviously doing my interviews with all these economists of different types, finding out what they know about MMT, in many cases not very much. But then I can educate them a bit.
I know they've published a few of your articles, haven't they, on their website?
Yeah, GIMS, yeah. And Warren put that paper on his website. If nothing ever happens in my life, Warren has put an article of mine on his website. And also he wrote an article with me. And I mean like me.
You're done now. That's your job done.
I've got my name and Warren's name on an article, you know. All the original thinking is Warren. I just tie it together, you know. And what was quite nice about Warren, I said, what are we going to do with it? And he goes, well, I don't really know because I only wrote it for you. I thought, what a nice guy. Well, we could give it to GIMS. And he goes, brilliant idea. He just put excellent. Warren loves an exclamation mark in it.
So you wrote a paper for the fun of it?
Yeah, it was absolute sheer joy. I want to write something with Warren. He did with me. We did all this sort of Skype stuff. We wrote a paper. To me, it's the paper I wrote with Warren is just a mind-bending paper. It's like a seminal paper. I mean, he just annihilates the nature of monetary policy, and he talks about how the floor system, all the central banks around the world have all got it wrong. I mean, it's a big deal, that paper. But it's worth reading. That's a great paper, that central bank operations on the GIMS site.
Can you remember the name of the paper?
By Phil Armstrong and Warren Mosler, right?
Well, no.
That's the title. Warren comes first.
We'll find it. I thought it would be interesting, just in case there's any newbies that I've just stumbled across this podcast, how, presuming you've got an attentive, interested person, how would you say what MMT is to that person?
What I often do is, because I'm a bit of a stand-up comedian, what I'll normally do is I'll talk about the idea of the old Copernicus moment, which you've probably seen, where it's like in the medieval times, people thought that the Earth was the middle of the solar system. Because it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, the Earth's solid. It doesn't move. If it did, we'd fall off. And the sun goes round it because you can see it. You don't have to say that the Earth's at the middle of the solar system. It's obvious. So I'll start with something like that. Then I say, well, it's obvious now the government gets its money from taxes and it spends it. So only when you think about it, how can that be right? Then I'll get out, bits of paper, banknotes, and say, can you make these yourself, and do the usual idea that the government has to spend or lend money before it can tax. If it wasn't, the private sector would, be counterfeiting and have to make the money itself. So I kind of talk about the reversal of the system. So in other words, you then get to say, right, okay, I might talk about maybe the Romans or something like Warren does. I'd say, look, first thing is the tax liability. All right, so you'll say, right, say you got an army of Romans, you say to them, I want you to invade Gaul for me. And you might pick out members of the audience, to put in your army. I tried that once in a staff talk in the University of Buckingham. I ended up actually writing a paper on Cuba with a Cuba expert because I made him in charge of my army. But I'll say, say these members of the audience were my army. I say, right, what I want you to do is go and invade Gaul. And they say, well, I need paying. And I said, what I'm going to do is pay you with these little metal discs with my head on. And they go, what do I need those for? I said, well, before I pay you, I put a tax liability on the villages, and that comes first. So the tax liability comes first. The villages know that if they don't give my tax collectors a big bunch of these coins, I'm going to steal their children and burn their village, but they haven't got any. And then I'll say, can you make these coins yourself to the audience? And they go, what'll happen to you? Get killed. Right, okay. So there aren't any coins in existence. I can pay my soldiers in these coins, not because there's precious metal in. It's because they know they can go in the village and buy what they want from the village. The tax collectors collect at the other end, and that's how the system works. And I say, look, if I take too much away in tax, people will be so poor after they've paid the tax, they've got nothing left to spend on other stuff. So you get a thing called unemployment, people lying idle. All right, on the other way, if I spend loads and don't tax it back, I lose control of the tax system. My soldiers won't come work for me no more because they've got enough of those discs. And when they go and try and spend what they got, nobody will give them anything unless they give them loads and you get inflation. So then I'll talk about the trick for the government is spending enough net of tax and spending to maintain full employment. And that's my in. Obviously, it gets more technical and depends who's in the audience. Some people then go off on a tangent. But essentially, the size of the deficit doesn't matter. It's the functional finance thing. And I play around with coins, notes, get things off the audience, that sort of thing. That's the crucial thing. And I'll take the mickey out of Tories, which I love doing that. Philip Hammond, he ran a surplus, didn't he?
Yeah.
We're supposed to thank him. Why? Because he took more offers than was spent. He's destroyed some of our savings.
We're supposed to thank them for it, though, because they're fixing the roof.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And now I enjoy all that humorous stuff. But that's how I kind of do it.
So again, if anybody's late to the party, running a surplus, if you're a currency issuer, means that you are taxing more than you spend. So the other side of that equation means that the private sector is going to have to go into debt to have the same amount of money in the system or not, or lower their standard of living or similar. So surplus, we like the sound of the word. Hey, I've got surplus. It's like, no, the government's got surplus. Guess who's funding it? Yeah.
Can I just add to that? Because when I've been in discussions with post-Keynesians and we talk about that and they agree on many things, it's weird because they agree on so much and yet they kind of resist this thing. And something that they say is that, well, most of the economy runs on credit anyway. And it's perfectly possible for it to run pretty much like on 99% credit.
And when you say credit, you mean credit created by bank credit. So
yeah, by bank. To me, it appears like what they're saying is that the private sector of the economy, the non-government sector, does not need net financial assets. And I don't understand what they mean.
Let's say, for example, that if you take like the idea money is credit and debt, two things. So if you had like a pure credit economy where private borrowing in the terms of investment, which then the accounting record becomes a saving, if that was sufficient to generate full employment, then the government net spend could be zero. But the problem is it doesn't happen that. In reality, generally speaking, the non-government sector likes to net save. And if it wants to do that, the government has to run a deficit to allow full employment to be maintained, because otherwise the economy will shrink, if you see what I mean. So it's not that the private sector in principle could run at full employment without a deficit, provided that private borrowing is sufficient. The only problem with that is that it's like a collection of cards, as you say. There's no net saving in the system. So inside money sums to zero, Randy Ray in his 98 book. And it's like building up a tower of cards. You're not one and it all goes down. Warren said the reason that we had the crisis was the size of the government deficit, the government debt at the time was too small to support the credit structure. So in other words, there wasn't enough risk-free assets compared to risky assets in the system.
Let's just unpack that for a second. So when the government spends, it puts a risk-free asset in the private sector. So like MMT is say, government deficit is private sector surplus.
Yeah.
So our savings, that's every positive bank balance in the private sector, has come from the government running a deficit.
Yeah. Everything net. Yeah. Yeah. So if you take in Patricia's point that the non-government sector saving equals all the non-government sector borrowing, plus any net saving. The net saving on top of that is what comes from the government. So there's no government, there would be no net saving. Every pound of debt would have to be balanced by a pound of credit. And that's a very unstable system because if one goes, everybody else goes. And that was the ultimate in the financial crisis, where the size of, if you like, the net saving levels too small to support the structure. And it all went down like a pack of cards. So that's basically how the system works.
Warren talks about, when he goes on a look back on the last few decades, all of the expansions that he talks about or that he recalls all came from the kind of operation that you wouldn't allow on a look back. For instance, the Reagan years, he says, was driven by the S&L crisis. So basically, a lot of fraudulent loans given, and the private sector debt generated by that was written off. Billions of it was written off. So in effect, the government's still coming in there to support that credit structure.
Yeah.
And that's what drove the Reagan years, for instance. And then he talks about the dot-com boom, again, the Y2K, people spending to future-proof their computers when they didn't need to. And the government's just not been there except for this moment where they sort of backstopped all that bad debt in the S&L crisis.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
I mean, in a sense, debt drives growth. So the question is, if, for example, as you know, if you deregulate the banking system, banks are obviously creating a load of loans, and as they create a loan, well, loans create deposits. So if you like, the whole non-government sector balance sheet expands on both sides. No net saving, but that does fuel growth, but it's highly unstable, and sometimes it does go bang. And obviously, in the crisis. Basically, in America, the Ben Bernanke his operative had to provide the risk-free money back by data entry because the banks had overextended themselves. So at the end of the day, it's a sense where, private sector borrowing will fuel growth, but it's a very unstable way of doing it. Anything can happen at any time. The markets are very unstable, so you need a backstop to the system. And obviously you will get moral hazard, this argument. I mean, the state can give anyone any amount of money at any point in time. There never needs to be any private entity that goes bankrupt. You just press a button. But is that ethical? And I would argue not. And that's why banks should be restrained from what loans they can make, because otherwise you're getting in a sense where they can act in a very immoral fashion, expand their own balance sheets, destabilize the economy. And when it crashes, the state, which has got the breadsheet, is virtually, feels it maybe ought to give them their money back, in inverted commas, to prevent the system crashing.
And that's what the whole too big to fail thing means, isn't it? The whole system's at risk if we don't shore up these big players.
Is nationalising them an option, you think?
Well, that's quite an interesting question. I mean, obviously, stirring into politics, I would say, it is an option. The other option is to kind of take Warren's view of banks, is you tell them what they can do, not what they can't do. Because if you say what they can't do, they'll find something that's not on the list. Right, but you say, this is what banks can do. Banks are agents of the government anyway. They are privileged in the sense that they are allowed, what makes a bank as different to a fund, a bank's allowed to create state money. Not money that can be payable in taxes, but it's allowed to create state money on a spreadsheet. So you might argue, given that privilege, they ought to be nationalised. The downside of that is, of course, the flexibility idea, the idea that they will respond quickly to customers, etc. So I think they could be nationalised, and being a socialist, I'd probably go for that. So they would have to be very highly devolved and quite separate from too much centralised control, and be flexible in terms of providing the credit that ethical small business is required.
I guess the angle I was coming from was, obviously, I understand this is a political point. It's linked intrinsically to your views of how efficient government is, etc. If they're agents of the state, which MMT does say, then why not make that official? But you make an interesting point about decentralization and maybe the privatized aspect of it, damaging as it may be in some aspects, does allow for decentralization.
Yeah, I'm less... I mean, when I was younger, I would have definitely said nationalise them. And if push came to shove and you said, what would you do? I would nationalise them if I had the power to do so. Not a major issue in my sense. I think the crucial thing is correctly regulating them so they have to behave in such a way as to serve public purpose. And if you think about individual freedom, my view is always, I mean, there's a guy... R.H. Tornew wrote about what socialism was, about right relationships and things. So, for example, if you were a private individual and you had a good idea and you wanted to employ people, whether it be a bank or in a green business, if you felt you could do that and you could both get a good living for your family and your workers and protect the environment, and the state had set very careful rules as to what public purpose was. And you could meet all those rules. So you could look after your workers. You could be flexible. Then, to me, you should have the right, if you like, as an individual to do that. You know, I have a mate of mine lives close to me. He pays his cleaners in his office better than I get paid teaching in further ed when I work out the hours. And he's a Labour Party guy and he looks after his staff really well. I mean, impressively well. He agonises over what he's doing. He's very environmental and he obeys all the rules and more. And that's the crucial thing to me, because I argue a lot with a guy called Jeff Hodgson on Twitter, because he thinks all socialists just want to nationalise everything. And I said, well, not for me. I'm pragmatic about ownership. You know, like it's obvious the railways should be owned by the state, for example. But if you have a small, my daughter's a vegan, a small vegan calf, should that be sort of controlled? I don't. So should their menus be So no, I think a private individual should have the chance to operate their own business and make a living for themselves, provided it serves public purpose as well. You know, so for example, think private activities that don't serve public purpose, like for example, foreign exchange speculation, ban that straight away. You know, I go back to exchange controls, not because we need to have them to protect the currency, because it's unethical. I mean, I put that out on the Twitter to any right winger. You tell me what good currency speculation does. What benefit does it serve public purpose? None. It's just a wealth shuffling exercise, as you two know. So there are private activities that benefit both the person doing it and the community as a whole. Fine. If they only benefit the person doing it and to the detriment of the rest of society, ban it. Bit like Bill Mitchell, you know, regulate them away. And I'm very much in that regard. So tough banking regs, private, fine, or nationalised.
Well, he's a nationalise if you can, but if not, regulate.
Yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah. Politically, I'm pretty close to Bill.
As with many things, you know, Warren's answers, they're elegant.
Yeah.
You know, when he says, tell the banks what they can do. And if they want to do anything extra, they have to do the lobbying. They have to do...
Yeah.
I like that.
I very much like that. And then it also forces people to sit down and go, okay, well, what should banks be able to do? And it basically boils down to they should clear the checks.
Pretty much.
Hold money.
I'm living in my little ideal world. If you had a local banker, he or she should understand the problems of business in that community, like the problems that people face in employment, the environmental questions, all the questions of the area. So when you went with a business plan, they'd be able to help you, not just to do well for yourself, but in other words, your banker should be somebody who's fairly cagey with money and only lends it to you when he or she feels that you can repay. And also the activity would be one which would be a public value, you know, not something which is going to make some money out of nothing. So in other words, you're just increasing your relative command of real resources, but you're not putting anything in. These things are just pointless. So that's why, in an ideal banker, that's what a banker would be. Somebody who's wise with money, but wise with other things. And obviously, bankers should not be able to sell loans to other people. If you've got a loan on your books that where it says, you can't repackage it with a AAA and then flog it to someone else when it's only a triple F or something. I mean, all that stuff, lock them up for that. If you make a loan, you keep a loan.
Is it the way to say that you have to keep it until it's amortized?
Yeah. Technical term, I'll go with that.
You bear the consequences of your actions, basically.
Now we've been off into ideology land.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the sectoral balance identity. Now, when I was writing the question, I wrote down sectoral balance equation. Now, it's not an equation, is it? It's an identity. Yeah. Am I right there, or am I using the right word?
Well, yes and no.
It is an equation.
I think it starts from an equation, and then they move it around and make it an identity. Depends who you ask.
Right, okay.
Its end format is an identity, yeah.
So what's the difference?
Yeah, I would say that its sort of finished result is to be an identity. Because to start off with two equations, isn't it something like y equals c plus s plus m, and then y equals c plus d plus I, and then you cancel and fiddle about a bit and end up with the sectoral balances, s minus I equals, and then g and t and x and m on the other end. And they all have to sum to zero. So, the difficulty with the sectoral balances is that where does the causality lie? So in other words, like all identities, they just simply describe a situation, if you like, ex post. At the end, it must be true. But where does the causality lie? But what it does show you, I think, is that not all of the sectors can be in balance at once. It's not possible. So this idea of I don't know what it is, like the Victorian morality of the right wing. Also, well, we can all be in surplus. We work hard enough. The government have a surplus. We can have a trade surplus. And you can have a surplus too. Well, it just can't add up. And so when you look at the lines, they have to sum to zero. And so if you forget about the trade sector for a minute, if altogether the non-government sector in any given time period, like a year, has got a credit, the government, has to have exactly the same in deficit. And like I said with the Romans thing, I'd say to them, look, if I was your Roman, let's use pounds. If I spent £100 in a year and taxed back 80, I would say, what's my deficit? And they go, the better ones at maths, 20. Come from the audience. Who's got the 20? You guys. What's your surplus? 20. 20 equals 20. So at the end of the day, the deficit has to equal the saving. And before you had a spreadsheet, you had money. It's obvious. If I spent 100 quid in banknotes and taxed back 90, who's got the 10? The people I've spent it on. So the deficit has to be the same. So the next question follows from that, doesn't it? That if your deficit is, if you like, too small, private sector net saving is smaller than they want. And because of that, they worry and they cut their spending, don't they? Because they're nervous, they haven't got enough saving. And that shrinks the economy. So collectively, they're poorer. And when they're poorer, their net saving desires are lower at that point. And that hits an equilibrium, in theory, unless they all panic even more and it will shrink away to nothing, as Randy Ray points out in his 1998 book. So at the end of the day, the sectoral balances at the end of any time period must sum to zero. The art to it is you've got to make sure that the deficit is big enough so that, if you like, net saving is at high enough level to maintain full employment. Because if it's not big enough, the economy will shrink. Obviously, it's too big. If people have got more net saving than they want at full employment, they'll think, well, loads of money I don't want, I'm going to spend it. But at your full employment, you get inflation. So deficits do matter. The trick is getting it, obviously, at the right level, because you get inflation and cost push. So you might think, oh, we've got inflation, our deficit's too big, we better cut. But in fact, the inflation is not coming from that. And that's why politicians, who are not known for their brain power, often do exactly the wrong thing. Like, say there was an oil price rise that causes the price level to go up. Even though they got massive unemployment, we need to reduce our deficit. Well, why? It's nothing to do with that. Think, but they don't do that. Very interesting, the sectoral balance. I mean, the Win Godley thing, he did that with, and Mark Lavoie, who you may have come across. They've got that book, the big book they wrote together, Lavoie and Godley, and they go on to all the stock flow consistent modelling, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, they're very interesting. If you look at all the graphs, they all have to sum to zero. There's no way around. It has to. How they could not be identical, I don't know.
My question was, though, let's say we have G minus T, right? So that's government spending minus taxation.
Right, I'll try and remember this without a bit of paper, but go for it, yeah?
To me, G minus T is the deficit, yeah?
Yeah.
So whatever's appearing on the other side of that equation, the equals sign, is the private sector surplus or private sector savings. Now, when I look on the other side of that equation, let's take the foreign sector out for a minute, keep it simple. On the other side of that equation, with no foreign sector, it would look like this. G minus T equals S minus I.
Yeah.
So S being private sector savings, right?
Yeah.
Minus I.
Yeah.
Got all this way into MMT. I don't know what I is.
Investments.
I know what it is, but how does it come about?
In many ways, it's easier to think about I, although it's investment, defines it as borrowing. You might say, yeah, but hang on, people borrow for things other than investment. But if you imagine when, like Keynes was writing, the private sector, like ordinary people, like my granddad, there was no private credit, not out of banks, not for ordinary people. Nearly all borrowing was by firms. So firms borrowed to buy capital and equipment and expand, and that's why they call it investment. Nowadays, in a way, you still use I, but in many ways, it's easier to think of that as bank credit or just borrowing.
Or dissaving. I mean, it could be saving minus dissaving.
Yeah, so you could think of it as those terms. So in other words, if you imagine in terms of the ontology of money, all right, so what money is, right, all money starts from debt. So that's the first point. You can't save until someone's borrowed. So if you imagine that, say there was no money in the world, all right, and money is always debt, a bit of money, say a bit of paper with an IOU on it. Let's say I wrote IOU £10, Phil Armstrong, all right? Say, for example, Patricia, you trusted me, so you take, would you agree, that £10 debt? There is no other money. Would you? I went in debt first, I wrote the IOU. You've now got the bit of paper. I've gone into debt, you got the saving. So as Warren says, saving is mere the accounting record of borrowing. Or if you like, investment, you borrow from the banks and then it ends up as saving. Now, in this world, there's no government. So all the private saving, yours is all my debt. Now, if you wanted, but that's not safe, would you agree? Because I might not pay. Whoa, and that'll be what you've trusted me.
Your dog is suspicious of you as well.
So I might go bust. So what you might want is something safe. So if you had a government asset on top of that, say I'm bringing you in now, maybe say you put £10 worth of government debt into the system. Say you...
He really does not like that.
I think he doesn't like government.
So say you spent 20 as the government. So Chrissy, so you spent 20 as the government, you took 10 back off Patricia. She's now got another £10 saving, but that's net saving. All right, so she's got 20 now, 10 from me. And 10 from yourself. So that's how the system works. If you didn't have a government, S equals I, and all the I is caused by, all the saving is generated by the borrowing, or as the firm said, investment. That's where all these right-wing dudes go wrong, because they think that saving is a source of investment. They think that you've got to save first. It doesn't work like that.
Regardless of whether the investment comes from existing savings or from bank credit, the identity still works, it still stands.
Yeah, it still works. And also as well, existing savings at some point in the past must have been caused by borrowing.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So it's just going back into the past. So if you imagine it, that's kind of like more like the multiplier. If people start saving more, at any point, it's like there's a guy called Mead. Mead's, I think it was called, I'm going back a bit now, Mr. Mead's relation. And it's on about this idea of conservation of saving. So, for example, if you borrow some money and give it to someone or buy something off it, they then got the money. So the saving must equal what you borrowed. Now, if that changes hands, it generates more wealth. If it stops because someone decides they want to save it and sit on it, there's still always the same amount in the system. It just hasn't circulated enough to generate full employment. If later on some guy's got all that existing saving and just wants to go and spend it now, it just, if you like, it's probably the wrong way of putting it, restarts the multiplier. So all existing saving is, if you like, an accounting record of previous borrowing, if you see what I mean. What else could it be? Can't be anything else. So in a sense, what you're saying is exactly right. If the government runs a deficit, G minus T, it must add something to the side, which would be a net saving, which would add to the amount of saving that was caused by private borrowing. As I said, investment.
Let me examine it another way. So it's G minus T, and G is bigger than T, so we've got a positive number.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, let's presume there's one person in the economy.
Yeah.
I know what S is. It's my bank balance, right?
Yeah.
How do I make I happen if there's one individual in the economy? What would I be doing to make I greater than 1 or I greater than 0?
Well, the I is what comes out of nowhere.
Right, got it.
Right. So what you have to do is you can never start with S. So the problem you've got there is you phrase the question to say, well, I've got an S.
Got it.
The I always comes before the S. That's the point. That the best way of thinking about it is forget about the state for a moment and think, right, no one's got any money, no one's got anything. Where does it start from? It starts from me giving a bit of paper or a bit of anything that somebody thought was a token of my indebtedness. Minsky said anyone can issue money. The trick is getting accepted. You know, it's this old quotes. In other words, if, for example, for some reason you guys thought I was creditworthy and you accepted this with £10 on it, and then at the moment that you accept it, all right, I immediately am in debt. This is my IOU. So I'm in debt, £10, and you've got it. So investment always precedes saving. So when you to talk about your bank balance, which is your saving, has been created by only two things to do it. One, the government's deficit, or two, people going into debt privately somewhere else in the banking system. All right. Otherwise, it couldn't exist. It has no. All saving can only be caused by one of those two factors. So, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. It was starting with the government, basically, because that's kind of what we do with MMT. The money story starts with the government trying to provision itself, and it lays on a tax and yada, yada. So when I look at that equation, I do start with government. But like you say, you need to be able to understand where the I in the sectoral balance identity is. You've got to start at a different point.
And I think the story does start with government, because here's the thing. Let's say, for example, if there was no government, right, and I was like just a private individual, and I wanted to issue money, what would be the unit on it? Where's the unit of account come from? Now, at the end of the day, the thing is the state creates and introduces the unit of account. Now, once that's happened, the private sector can then create money in that unit of account. But the state has to invent the unit of account to start with. Otherwise, how would the private sector debt be denominated? What's it going to be in? So you might have kind of credit, like the sense of, well, I'll, so many pigs or something, but that's not money. That's just barter. So you have to, you end up with a circular thing with money. The ontology of money has given people one massive load of headaches. But to me, the best way of understanding money is just a system of debits and credits. That's what it is. And it always starts with somebody going into debt. Maybe the government, which goes into debt, as Warren says, in order to provision itself. A private individual goes into debt and issues the IOU. And you could even, if you want to be very philosophical, you could say it starts with the desire on the part of someone to accept someone's debt. Maybe that comes first, which is like the MMT's way of viewing the current account deficit. They always say current account deficit is foreigners' desire to save your money, isn't it? Net. And I really like that idea. I'd never have thought of it if I'd not heard Warren say that. All these things, all these insights come from Warren. He just sees things differently, like a true polymath. But to me, they're, I'll say obvious, but they're clear now, but I would have never have seen them without Warren showing them.
Can I just add something? So in that equation, we remove the foreign sector.
Imports.
So kind of exports minus, is it X minus M is the exports minus imports. So it's just basically the balance from the external sector. But if we considered that balance as well, to include that as part of the savings.
Yeah, because you could argue that in a sense, we're just making an arbitrary distinction, aren't we, between which non-government sector is holding saving of the pound. Is it foreigners or is it British?
I guess because it's measured separately.
Yeah, and so it really, in essence, it doesn't really make any difference. If you're running a big deficit, it means that the foreigners, inverted commas, have got more net. They've got net saving in your currency. Now, the beauty of that is that means you can run a current account deficit because they'll send you, as Warren said, loads of real goods and services, and they're prepared to accept your money in savings in advance, and they think they're winning. And that's quite interesting. You can't, like, for example, go back to me. If these are money...
For the listeners, Phil is holding up a dog toy.
So imagine then that you think these dog toys are worth £1 million each, right? So what happens is I keep giving you these dog toys, which I've got in a bag. I've got loads of them. And you keep sending me, like, houses, cars and planes, and I'm getting all this great stuff to consume, and all you've got is a huge, great sack of these. Now, the thing is, that's what the Chinese are doing, isn't it? They're sending over big boatloads of stuff to America, and they're just saving the stuff. And in the same way, it's exactly the same as if the private sector if you were a private sector saving, if you're a worker, all right, you might be working hard and saving your money, not spending it. So in other words, what you do is not consuming. So it's the same basic idea, it's just who's got the saving.
There is a fear, I think, from some people that, for example, the Chinese may tomorrow decide to redeem all the dollars that they've saved. And
Warren says they just moved the balances back. If you're talking about the bonds.
But they couldn't do it all in one go because they would undermine the value of what they're holding.
I think the dog pitched his dog toy, but if you take the same analogy, if the Earth, for example, you've been sending me loads of fantastic stuff and you'd really got a huge basket full of these dog toys by now, and you thought after a while, come on, we've been mugs here. We've given this Phil Armstrong guy loads of good stuff, and all we got these dog toys. We want something of our dog toys. So you come to me with your dog toys and you then have to buy stuff off me with the dog toys. Now, if, for example, I've agreed to produce goods and services for you in exchange for the dog toys, then that's what I'll do. So in a sense, if the Chinese decide that they want to spend those dollars at some future time in the American economy, then the Americans will just have to produce more stuff and get more employment making it.
Jobs.
And if obviously they get to reach full employment, sadly, that will drive the price level up, and the poor old Chinese and find that their dollars won't really work as much, and sadly, the value of your dog toys will go down. So basically, it doesn't work. And also, I could put a tax on those because they're my dog toys and I issued them. So at the end of the day, I can unilaterally reduce the value of those, as kings have done in time immemorial, going back to history. They would cry down the currency. So in other words, you always take a risk, don't you, taking those dog toys, because I've given you them. You give me £1 million worth of stuff. But you don't know whether in the future I might levy a 500% tax on some of it.
Yeah.
They're taking a risk.
That's up to me. You're taking the risk, not me. I got the stuff. You've only got the dog toys. So in other words, the Chinese think they're winning, but they're not.
And so do the Americans. The Americans think the Chinese are winners.
The question really is, if the Chinese decide at some future they want to stop sending tons of real goods and services to America. Now, that might be good in a green sense. It's a separate issue. If they say, well, we've had enough now, we're not going to keep working flat out to send you real goods and services, so that you can consume while we only get electronic balances of dollars. We're going to stop doing it. Then the Americans, they'll have to think, we better make them ourselves. Hard luck. The game's up.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the same way if you guys said, we're not going to take your dog toys no more, you'll have to do the work. And that's really the problem. There is no other problem. That's just the way it goes.
As a result of this, so there is a lot of economists, I believe Medway is one of them, who is actually terrified of the external balance and basically wants to almost run policies to control the external balance. And what I've seen MMTs tell him is that you can only, what people do is they subdue or they suppress consumption at home or, of imports to try and kind of balance the imports and exports. But at the same time, you cannot control the policy of another country in terms of saving your currency. You may not succeed even if you suppress consumption at home.
But what he's trying to do is impossible, really. And also he doesn't understand the system. And there's a little bit of thing that a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. Like him. Tom Pally is a nice guy. I interviewed him. I like Tom. He's done some very good work. But when it comes to MMT, he just doesn't get it. He doesn't get the system. So with Meadway, he's kind of almost a good economist. He just doesn't get it.
That's worse than being a bad
worse, because what happens is that he almost gets it, but when it comes to the crunch, he doesn't. It's almost like, I don't be overdoing it, but say someone's going to get married, and when they kind of get to the church, they bottle it and run away. It's better if they didn't even start. So like Meadway, he should have chosen a different career. He's quite clever, but at the major point, there are a lot of people on Twitter are a bit like that. They kind of know it, but when it comes to the crunch, they just fall at the last hurdle. And also a lot of people are a bit frightened of MMT, and I understand that, because if they accept MMT's right, then they've got to accept they've made a lot of mistakes, and a lot of the things they've previously said, they have to recant it. And this is quite a big issue for some, so they'll run. But I said they can run, but they can't hide. And one of the things people say, well, how do you know MMT is right? Well, I go, I'm a comprehensive school teacher in Middlesbrough, which is the tuppenny town in the north of England. I'm only a teacher. I don't know anything. So how can I go to the city? When I did, I got invited to the city. I've got all these top bankers in front of me. And my PhD supervisor is a tough guy, great guy. He's a Marxist. And he said, look, Phil, take no prisoners from these guys. No nice teachers there. So I just argue with all of them and beat them all. Because I said, you don't know how the system works. I said, how does the government spend? What happens on the balance sheet system? These are cities. You don't know. And I was quite tough with these guys. And I beat them all. Now, they're too thick to understand I've won. That's another question. Well, how is that possible? How can a guy like me, who's just a comprehensive school teacher, go in to meet all these top guys and beat a man's down? Because I've got the right system. And if I go back to Copernicus, you think about it, imagine that you were a guy that thought the Earth was in the middle of the solar system, right? So you were a brilliant astronomer, you had all the gear. Why do you get everything wrong? And then another guy's not very good, but he happens to know it's the sun. He beats you every time because he's got the right model. He knows why the brooms of Jupiter are where they are. So that's why MMT have got all. We all know that if you run a big government deficit and you got your own currency, the interest rate will fall to zero. It won't go up. That's what I did in my thesis. Every single country throughout the crisis, all their interest rates fell down, not up. So, with the interest rate all went down every time, every year.
And that's why they brought in this idea of the liquidity trap. Am I right?
Well, Sonny, there is no such thing as a liquidity trap.
To try and sort of like make their thing work.
Yeah, the liquidity trap's made up. What is it? Well, Keynes said it might happen, but probably wouldn't. It's the idea that you can't drive the interest rate below a certain level because the demand for money becomes perfectly elastic. Well, that's not right, because the interest rate in Japan is whatever level it could be. It could be zero instead. It doesn't exist. Now, as Warren points out, I often talk to Warren, the liquidity trap might exist under fixed exchange rates or a gold standard, because if you drove the interest rate below a certain level, everybody would want to hold your money to convert to gold at a fixed rate. But there is no such thing as a liquidity trap under floating exchange rates. If you like, the state is a monopoly issue of the currency. The central bank, the banks are agents of the state. So the price, the own rate, the interest rate is whatever rate, including negative. I'm not saying you should do that. They do. So it doesn't exist. Yeah. So this idea of improvement, MMT works when your interest rate's too low, and you can't use money. But monetary policy never works.
Yeah.
I mean, and as Warren in this paper, and Warren and I wrote, they've got the idea, they've put the interest rate down, it boosts demand. We put the interest rate around, it reduces demand. They've got it all the wrong way around, because the debt levels are so high. You put the interest rate down, the repayment levels on government debt go down, so you deprive the private sector of income.
Interest income.
And that's a much bigger effect than the other. So that's what's happening. They're trying to increase the economy speed by putting the brake on.
Did you include in your paper any figures on that? Like how, say, for the UK, is there a chart or something of how much money was being injected through interest rates versus how much the increase in loanings was?
On that point, no, because it was a quite short paper for GIMS. In terms of the interest rate one, the long-term interest rate versus like when you've got a relationship between the interest rate and the size of the deficit, yes, I've got correlation coefficients, I've got all the figures. That's all in my thesis.
Oh,
so
nice.
I've got the figures for that. And I can prove it all goes the other way. They're all completely wrong. Warren's probably got the figures somewhere for... Was it him that told me about that interest rate being the wrong way around? I never thought. I just thought, wow, I never thought. I mean, it's obvious now, isn't it?
They've been using monetary policy the wrong way around.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon starting at $1 a month and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.